The defense was already being divided, not because the structure failed to react, because reaction had already begun spreading outward before command still existed in one piece. Inside modern missile defense coordination systems, this is where the structure begins to fail. Not when the first interceptor misses, not when the screen goes blank, not when the threat arrives too quickly to process. The failure begins earlier. At the moment, defensive responsibility starts moving across the structure faster than shared authority can still keep that response unified. A track enters the defensive picture, then another, then more. The system does not preserve them as abstract warnings for long. Because missile defense coordination systems are not built only to observe pressure. They are built to turn pressure into assignment. They must determine where defensive action should go, which sectors should carry it, which nodes should prepare, which layers should engage, and how the burden of response should be spread before the compression becomes unmanageable. That is their purpose, and that is where the danger enters. Because the moment defensive burden starts spreading outward, the structure is no longer managing information alone. It is beginning to divide authority across action. One unit receives part of the engagement. Another receives another. One layer prepares for one window. Another for a different one. One sector treats the problem as its own responsibility. Another adjusts around that assumption. And once that division begins, the defense no longer depends only on whether each part can act. It depends on whether all of those actions still belong to the same command decision. That is the requirement. Shared authority must survive the spread of response. Because a missile defense structure can remain highly active while already losing the coherence that makes its activity one defense instead of many separate reactions. And once that line is crossed, the structure does not become passive. It becomes divided under pressure. The danger grows as defensive roles begin spreading across layers, nodes, batteries, and sectors. Because intercept allocation creates movement before unified authority is fully secured. One element is assigned one portion of the defensive burden. Another is positioned to carry a different engagement window. Another prepares to absorb what the first layer cannot hold. Another adjusts to preserve coverage elsewhere once that burden has already been spread. The structure appears coordinated because every layer is still receiving assignment. But assignment is not the same as shared authority. It is possible for the system to look synchronized while the command logic governing intercept distribution is already beginning to split. Because every defensive assignment changes the burden carried by every other assignment. The moment one layer is tasked with one intercept path, another layer inherits the consequence of that tasking. The moment one sector is assigned one defensive window, adjacent sectors must begin recalculating around a commitment they do not fully own. The moment one node receives engagement responsibility, the rest of the structure starts reorganizing around that assignment, whether or not shared command has fully stabilized why that burden now belongs there. That is where pressure becomes dangerous. Not because the structure lacks capability, because defensive burden is already being allocated faster than shared authority can still govern the allocation as one command act. And once the burden of interception is spreading across multiple points at once, authority has to do more than approve motion. It has to preserve one ownership structure across the whole engagement. It has to answer the most dangerous question in time. Who is actually carrying the defense as one unified command decision? Because if that answer begins fragmenting, then intercept allocation itself starts creating structural instability. Now one part of the system believes it owns one engagement path. Another believes it owns adjacent coverage. Another believes it owns escalation control. Another believes it owns correction once commitments have already been made. No layer is fully detached, but no layer is clearly carrying the whole defensive outcome. And that is where shared authority begins to weaken. Not by disappearing, by thinning across too many live defensive assignments at once. The system still looks disciplined, still looks responsive, still looks operational. But beneath that surface, the defense is no longer being preserved as one unified command structure under compression. It is being divided across multiple active intercept responsibilities that do not all return to the same center with equal force. And the wider that allocation spread becomes, the harder it is for command to reassert itself as something singular. Then the engagement begins hardening. Now defensive assignments are no longer provisional. They are becoming active intercept commitments. One layer is already moving. Another is preparing to engage its assigned window. Another is holding for its own intercept condition. Another is adjusting around commitments that have already taken form elsewhere in the defense. This is the point where intercept allocation begins outrunning shared authority. Not because no authority exists, because authority no longer arrives as one coherent force across the full defensive structure. The system continues assigning intercept burden. But the spread of defensive commitment has started moving faster than unified ownership of the engagement. And once that happens, every additional assignment makes correction harder. Because a distributed missile defense structure does not pause cleanly once intercept logic begins spreading through it. Each assignment creates expectation. Each expectation creates dependency. Each dependency makes the next change more difficult to absorb. One sector cannot simply release its assigned burden without forcing exposure into another. One battery cannot simply reinterpret its role without altering engagement timing elsewhere. One defensive layer cannot simply withdraw from its commitment without transferring consequence into adjacent layers already shaped by that commitment. So the defense keeps moving, not because it is unified, because its intercept assignments are now protecting themselves. This is what makes the failure so dangerous. The system remains energetic. It remains procedural. It remains full of active defensive logic. But it is no longer clear that all of that movement still belongs to one governing engagement decision. Now command is trying to supervise a defense that has already spread across multiple active points of intercept responsibility. One part of the structure governs one assigned path. Another governs another. Another attempts to preserve broader coherence across commitments it did not originate. But the broader the allocation becomes, the less obvious it is where the defense outcome is actually owned. And that is the moment the structure begins crossing into collapse. Because missile defense coordination only works when intercept distribution and shared command remain fused. Once they begin separating, the structure does not stop defending. It starts defending in fragments. And once multiple intercept commitments are active without shared ownership, correction becomes fragmented. Not impossible. Fragmented. Now every correction must move through a defensive structure already divided by live intercept responsibility. One assigned path needs one adjustment. Another assigned layer needs a different one. Another resists change because its current commitment now protects the defensive balance around it. Another delays correction because shifting too late may transfer exposure into sectors already carrying burden assigned earlier in the engagement. So the structure loses the ability to correct as one body. Every change becomes local before it becomes engagement-wide. Every adjustment arrives into a defense already shaped by separate intercept assignments. That means accountability begins to collapse. Because if the defense outcome deteriorates, where does responsibility settle? With the layer that assigned the first intercept burden? With the sector that carried the engagement forward after that burden was spread? With the node that preserved timing across only part of the defense? With the element that failed to realign once the allocation logic shifted? The answer becomes unstable because the defense itself was unstable as an ownership structure. No single failure point has to exist. That is what makes this category so severe. The structure can collapse responsibility without collapsing defensive activity. And once that happens, every part of the system can still appear to have executed its assigned role, while the defense as one unified command act still fails. That is the defining consequence. No shared authority remained strong enough to govern the engagement from intercept allocation through correction to outcome. So the defense was never fully owned. It was only distributed. And a distributed defense without shared ownership produces a uniquely dangerous condition. It creates a structure in which active intercept commitments continue, responsibility diffuses, and command arrives too weakly to reclaim the engagement once allocation has already spread across the system. From the outside, this can look like complexity. From inside the system, it is something worse. It is a defense structure that can still assign intercept burden, still spread commitments, still appear synchronized, while no longer possessing a durable center capable of saying, this entire defensive outcome belongs here. And when that center disappears, even partial success becomes unstable. Because the structure no longer knows how to hold the engagement together as one command decision from beginning to end. The doctrine is unforgiving. Missile defense coordination systems do not fail only when they cannot respond. They fail when they can distribute response faster than they can preserve shared authority over what that response means. That is the boundary. Because defense is not merely the presence of multiple active intercept paths. It is the preservation of one governing command logic across all of them. The structure must do more than allocate. It must preserve unified ownership of the engagement while allocation is occurring. It must ensure that distributed action still belongs to one command decision. It must ensure that correction can still return through a structure that recognizes one center of responsibility. It must ensure that every defensive commitment remains subordinate to shared authority instead of slowly replacing it. Because once allocation starts becoming the dominant force in the structure, command begins arriving after distribution instead of governing it. And once command arrives second, defense has already been transformed. It is no longer coordination. It is reaction spread across a system. That is the real danger in this category. Not that multiple nodes are acting. Not that multiple sectors are involved. Not that defensive assignments are being made under pressure. All of that is normal. The danger begins when those assignments no longer remain held inside one durable authority structure strong enough to own the whole outcome. At that point, the system may still look disciplined, but discipline is no longer the same as coherence. It may still look synchronized, but synchronization is no longer the same as command. And it may still look like defense, but a defense structure that can allocate intercepts without preserving shared authority is no longer coordinating defense. It is only distributing reaction. The moment intercept responsibility spreads farther than shared command can still hold, missile defense stops being one defense and becomes a structure reacting in pieces.